This session says, this election, which we expect will be held in early November in Myanmar, is really potentially a watershed moment in Myanmar's transition from a military authoritarian government to a parliamentary democracy. And this election is not just going to be for the national government, but also for 14 state and regional governments. And I should let you know that this event is co-sponsored by the Asia Society Policy Institute and by the Southeast Asia Department in the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And I also want to place on the record our appreciation for financial support for this series by the Japan External Trade Organization. So thanks to them. Now, some of you came at the first event that we had in this series of Myanmar Votes 2015, which we had a few weeks ago, when we had Thura Shweman here. And if you weren't here, you can always go to our website and take a look at the video, because I think it was a fascinating conversation with somebody who's currently the Speaker of the Union Parliament, that is not just the lower house, but also the upper house at this point, the joint parliament, as well as a possible presidential contender. And we hope to have a series of events on Myanmar Votes 2015, and this is the second such event. And this event, we hope, will provide you with an overview of what the issues and challenges are, and we expect to follow this up then with events which take a deep dive onto more specific issues, the role of the military, for example, the role of the ethnic peace process and its impact, possible impact on the elections, the economy and the elections, and of course political parties and personalities and the elections. So I hope you'll be able to come to all those events as well, and we expect to have a great series of panels that will discuss those issues. I also want to let you know that we have at the Carnegie website a special web page on Myanmar Votes 2015, where we have background papers and we have other papers which lay out some of the details. And we hope to bring more articles and put them on that web page. So please keep taking a look as we update that information and bring out new information. So with that introduction, it's my great pleasure to introduce this incredibly distinguished panel, and I'm very grateful to all of them for coming this afternoon. We have Priscilla Clapp, who's a senior advisor to the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Asia Society. She's a recognized expert in Myanmar, and she served as U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Yangon from 1999 to 2002. We have Scot Marciel, who is a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs of the U.S. Department of State, and he was previously the ambassador to Indonesia. And finally, to my right, Professor David Steinberg, who is a distinguished professor emeritus of Asian Studies at Georgetown University and is a specialist in Myanmar. And in fact, I didn't bring the book with me, has just brought out a book. What's it called?
Myanmar,
The Dynamics of Polity.
Evolving polity.
Of evolving polity. I should have brought the book, but I do recommend it to all of you. It's a remarkably well-informed book with incredible detail and a very deep understanding of what's going on in Myanmar by a series of authors. Professor Steinberg edited it and also contributed some articles to it, but I would strongly recommend it to all of you. Now, what I've agreed with the panelists is that they will initially give a 5 to 10 minute introduction to their views about the upcoming elections, and then we'll have a conversation for a while, and then finally I'll open it up to the audience as well for you to ask questions. So let me ask Priscilla Clapp to begin. Priscilla.
Now, you told me that you were going to ask me why the elections matter.
Yes.
My thoughts on why the elections matter. So I have two thoughts on why they matter. First is, it's a test for the military, essentially. Are they going to allow these elections to be free and fair? It looks at this point like they're doing everything they need to do in the preparatory phase to make the elections as free and fair as they can. There are some problems in there, which we can get to later. But right now they're headed for what look like free and fair elections. The second reason is because the results of this election will probably bring about the first stage of a coalition government. And this is something that we have all been wishing for more than 20 years, since 1990. It cannot be all one way or all the other way at this point. If the military is serious about moving forward with the reform process. If the elections go wrong, then all bets are off, I would say. But there's a relationship between the free and fairness of the elections and the degree of coalition that comes about. And we can get into those details later. But those are the two big issues, I think, in this election. And I think that's what's on the minds of the Burmese.
Okay, thanks, Priscilla. Scott.
Wow, I don't think I can be as concise as Priscilla, but I'll try to be almost half as thoughtful and things. I think when we look at these elections and we're watching the preparations extremely closely, we of course look at it in the context of the broader picture of what's happening in Myanmar. And you know the story. After 50 years of harshly repressive military government, 3 or 4 years ago, beginnings of an opening and of a reform process that has been significant. I was just there again about 10 days ago. I had spent some time there before the reforms began, and if you've been before and after, you can see yourself a lot has changed, significant change, but still huge challenges remaining, I think everyone recognizes. And although we haven't used the term that the elections are a test, I like that concept. Certainly the elections, which we expect to be held perhaps November, but around November, are hugely important for the country. They will be, could be, if done properly and fully implemented, will be the first, could be the first real credible democratic elections in the country nationwide in a very, very long time. So what are we looking for? What's our agenda? Again, our whole agenda with Burma or Myanmar is to support this democratic transition in all of its aspects: economic reform, the peace process, improvement in human rights, certainly a move toward democracy, including via elections, increased freedoms, etc., progress in a really complicated situation in Rakhine State. So the elections fit in as an important piece of that. And there's certainly the one item on the agenda for the next several months that has the greatest potential to mark a major milestone in a positive way. And that's our hope. I won't make any predictions. I'll let Priscilla and maybe the distinguished professor who can make some predictions. But certainly, as Priscilla said, there's some, at this point, if the elections were to go ahead as things now stand, there's some real flaws. There's the fact that 25% of the seats are held by non-elected military. There's the fact that the so-called white card holders at this point have been disenfranchised. The fact that people like Aung San Suu Kyi wouldn't be able to be candidates for president. So that at this point, we're still pushing for constitutional amendments and further reform to make the elections even better. But I think at this point, as Priscilla said, it looks like all the relevant institutions, the Union Electoral Commission and others, the parties, are preparing for what they expect to be real elections and hopefully real credible elections that will involve free and open campaigning. And in the end, for us, what are we looking for? Whether the people of the country feel that the election results reflect the will of the people. So we don't have a predetermined position on which party does what, but do the people of the country feel that these elections represent their will? And if they do, these elections can be a very significant step forward. They won't be a panacea. They won't solve all the other problems, but they could be an important step in injecting more momentum into the broader reform effort, in boosting the trust and confidence of the people. My experience in my trips there, people are, speaking very generally, of course, people are hopeful, but they're still wondering. They went through a lot for a lot of years, and so there's still a lot of caution and worry out there. So a successful election could, I think, give people more confidence in this process, and of course, could and should result in a new government that we hope has a mandate to continue the reform process. So we view these elections as hugely important, and if they're successful, could really boost the country forward in a significant way. We're supporting the election process with a fair amount of assistance for the Union Electoral Commission in terms of training poll watchers as well as political parties, not obviously siding with any particular individuals or parties, but trying to support the process. And it's going to be a difficult election for the Electoral Commission to run, even with the best of intentions. But it's hugely important. I don't think you can understate the importance of it, and something we're going to watch extremely closely. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. David.
I'm afraid my style is not as lapidary as my colleagues here. Let me say, I think we're dealing with 6 distinct aspects of the election process, but we conflate these into the election itself. Those are the campaign, the elections themselves, the interim period between the elections and the new government and what happens then, the new government and the internal reactions to it, the international reactions to this whole process, and then the future prospects for the government. Elections alone do not a democracy make. We have seen that in many different places. They're critical, but they're not sufficient for a democracy. In Thailand, as an expert on Thailand said last week, that when finally there are elections in Thailand, we'll say, well, now we'll get back to democracy. But he argues, no, you won't get back to democracy because the cultural values, the hierarchical values of Thailand will not allow that to happen in a way that we will feel is adequate. I think Myanmar is in a better position because it is a more egalitarian society than Thailand. We've already demonstrated by working with this government that the elections, fraudulent elections, can also work in a way, because that's what the 2010 elections were in Myanmar. They were manipulated very, very clearly. Now, I may be a bit cynical because I'm from Boston, and I grew up under Boston's Mayor James Michael Curley, who was elected as mayor from jail. So
I was there too.
So that may color my views. But there are 3 things that are going to be important in this election that we have to understand as background. Those are the overwhelming influence of nationalism, and nationalism not only among the Burman population, but among the minority populations as well. This leads to a very distinct sense of vulnerability and a suspected subversion of the culture of the society, and then bombastic responses often from the government to these perceived dangers, even though we may regard those dangers as being overstated. But that does nevertheless mean that they're not perceived as such. The second element is that the military has designed a system for their perpetual control. It will eventually fail. They mistrust the civilian population, politicians, and this must be overcome. This is reflected in the Constitution, of course, and the 25% military as, quote, guardians of the state, as the Burmese academics will put it. The third issue, which I regard as the central issue facing the state since 48, is the majority-minority issues. Though democracy is secondary in my view. No government has solved the problem, and the problem remains. The military made it worse. This government is doing more than any other government, but there still is a difficulty. To give you an example of that difficulty, of the 12% of the legislature that is now retired military, this is not the active duty ones, the retired military, and of the 63 surveyed, all are Burman Buddhists with one exception, a Chin Christian who was a corporal. Everybody else was an officer except this one guy. It indicates the issue of the minorities and the control of the Burman population. The campaign itself, is the Election Commission up to the job? Probably not. There are over now 80 parties, and we know that the reforms that have been instituted in the past have not always been carried out on the periphery of the bureaucracy or the government itself. So I think that there are likely to be issues, but I think the votes will be generally fairly counted. What about the elections themselves? Well, they've agreed to observe as the Carter Center has come on board. The civil society elements are involved in the process. There are likely to be problems there, and anomalies are inevitable, but I think the votes will be fairly counted. The interim period, that's another issue. Aung San Suu Kyi will not be allowed to rerun for the presidency or the vice presidency, but she could be the kingmaker of the vice president and could choose that person if that person came from the NLD. One of the questions that we don't have an answer to is the continuing role of General Than Shwe, former head of state. What is that role? There are disputes. Certainly, critical issues probably he has some say over. And certainly the reforms could not have been instituted without his general approval in the broad sense. But we don't know how much influence he will have in choosing the new president, and that will be critical. The new government will remain under military control. If you look at the reintroduction of the permanent secretaries that was announced earlier this year, 16 of the 23 are former military people. That indicates then that these civil servants, theoretically, will have strong military ties and military loyalties. All of the director generals of the departments are former military, and half of the deputy director generals are former military. So you see that there is this control, even whatever government is elected, the bureaucracy will still be under strong military issues. What about the international reactions? Well, Prime Minister Cameron of the UK already said if Aung San Suu Kyi can't run for the presidency, the vice presidency, the elections are not free and fair. I mean, he's on the record. The US has been, I think, a little more discreet. They want it to be all-inclusive. That's a very good phrase, I think. But the implications are that if they're not, there will be some problems. We have, before the legislature, the US Congress, a bill introduced last April, House Bill 4733, which basically says if Aung San Suu Kyi can't run from the presidency and the military is not under civilian control, security assistance should cease. That bill will not be passed, but the fact that it's there is important. It's important there for two possible reasons. One is theater, to please elements of the population without any chance of it being passed, or it is so naive that it makes real questions about the Congress's ability to make foreign policy intelligently. So we will see these issues come up, and you can be sure that the human rights groups will pick on these issues as real issues. Whatever happens, Japan will go along with the deal unless it is so blatantly false that the international pressures will be too great on Japan. But their commitment is already very heavy. China will probably regard all of this as a part of the pivot for the US and therefore suspect, but they will go along, and of course ASEAN will, of course, go along. The future prospects, to end this, there will be an attrition of military control. It's underway. They have controlled all the social mobility in that society. That is ending. And as it ends, there will be new people coming up, especially through the political process, the economic process, the civil society, and that will change the nature of the game. But it will be a slow process. That's the problem. We want instant change, but we need to be patient about that change because it will not come immediately and it will not come by the time of the elections themselves. So as I would like to end by quoting an eminent Burmese who was here a couple months ago at a conference. And he was asked about his outlook on the situation. He said, "I am frustratingly optimistic."
Thank you, David. So, Priscilla, I'm going to ask you the first question. David laid out these sort of 5 stages in the whole electoral process. But I think it might be a good thing for all of us if you could elaborate on the electoral process itself, from the parliamentary elections all the way to the final appointment of the president.
Sure. Now that I'm no longer with the government, I can be brutally analytic. There's really two separate but related stages to the elections. The first one is the parliamentary elections, and this is a general election for members of parliament. The 25% military are appointed later by the commander-in-chief, but the other 3/4 of the upper and lower house are elected by people according to township, which raises other questions, but we won't get into that. The second stage in the elections comes after the new parliament is seated. And let's say the elections are in early November. The parliament will be seated probably in January, sometime in January. The parliament will then go about electing its own leaders. In probably February or early March, probably late February, if it goes according to the way it did last time, the parliament will divide into 3 parts. The elected members of the upper house, which number 168 if all the seats are full. The elected members of the lower house, which number 330 if all the seats are full, and these are just civilian members. And the military, the 25% military from the upper and the lower house, are one group which numbers 166. Each group nominates a candidate for vice president. All 3 of them will win, either president or a vice presidential seat. So it's important who they nominate, because they are in line to be president one way or the other for the whole term, unless they get fired like one did. Then, when these 3 nominees have been selected and vetted and make sure that they meet all of the criteria required of a presidential candidate in the Constitution, the whole parliament comes together as the Union Parliament. We call it a joint session. They call it Pidan Zulhata, meaning the Union Parliament. And they vote. It's a simple majority vote. The one that gets the most votes is president. The next one down is first vice president. The next one is second vice president. Doesn't really matter. There's not much difference between first and second. The president is the one that matters. So if you look at the numbers, 168, 166, 330, the one of those that has the best chance to become president is the one that's nominated by the lower house.
By the elected members of the lower house.
Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. But then what about the state and regional elections, David? I mean, we have 14 state and regional elections going on at the same time, right?
And they have 6 subunits also.
So are they important? Should we be paying attention to them?
I think we should be paying more attention into the future. They are theoretically very important. They have not done anything yet. They have not illustrated any sort of leadership, and they don't have the capacity to do so. But President Thein Sein, yesterday I believe it was, said something very important. Publicly, it was in the New Light of Myanmar, that they will change the constitutional appendices to allow the minority groups to have more say over resources. In other words, they will give them more money, which will mean that the local legislatures ought to have a greater role. This is one of the really critical things about minority-majority relations. This has been an issue in the Philippines. It's not just a question of autonomy for the Moro National Liberation Front, but it's a question of who gets the resources out of extractive industries in those areas. So this is an important change. If I were running an aid program in Myanmar, I would be thinking very carefully, what could I do to allow these groups to have more capacity to deal with their own problems? Because if we're talking about pluralism, we're talking about democracy, we're talking about pluralism, and minority relations as being critical, then these organizations should be assisted to be helped to resolve some of these issues.
I mean, that's a remarkable statement by President Thein Sein, because in a sense, it's the first time that a president of Myanmar has actually broached the idea of a federal-like structure. And in fact, this was an idea that was put forward also to push on the ethnic, the peace talks.
Yeah, and the peace talks are important to his heritage, if you will, the heritage of his administration, and the reputation, I think, of the military itself.
Okay, we'll come back to the...
Can I add something to that?
Please.
Yeah.
This proposal was actually introduced by the military members of Parliament into the Parliament in March.
Good.
To change the two schedules.
So let me come back to a point that you made, and I want to ask you this question, Priscilla. David mentioned the idea of some constitutional amendments. So is there any likelihood of constitutional amendments taking place before the elections? Or is there a possibility that there might be a referendum on constitutional amendments as a parallel a track to the elections?
Yes and yes.
So please explain.
First of all, I don't think there'll be significant changes to the Constitution, but there can be minor changes, and I suspect that there will be minor changes because there are some problems in the Constitution, inconsistencies and other things that I think the military will have no problem changing.
What are we waiting for before we know what possible changes are
We're
likely to
waiting
take
for the
place?
Parliament to vote on proposals for amendments, and they haven't voted yet. Now, the Parliament, I've just learned, is supposed to go out of session around the 20th of June. So sometime between now and the 20th of June, I'm waiting to see a vote in Parliament. But I think that Shui Man, and he actually said that when he was here, is having trouble bringing it to a vote. That's one thing that they were trying to discuss in the six-party talks, and they haven't been able to. The military is playing games with this. But the second question about the referendum, if not every amendment to the Constitution requires a vote in a referendum. Right. So if there are some insignificant changes to the Constitution, they won't need a referendum. That's simply a parliamentary vote, and it happens. But if they have significant changes to sections of the Constitution, as spelled out in section in 436A, then they have to go to referendum. It's too late to have a separate referendum. It's much too expensive. They're not going to run two separate elections between now and the 1st of November. So if they do want to have one in time for the next government, they're going to have to run it at the same time as the elections. And they've broached this possibility. They're talking about it. Both Shui Man has mentioned it and others recently have mentioned it. If there are significant amendments voted by the Parliament.
If there are significant amendments. But do you think there's a high probability that there will be significant amendments voted by Parliament?
No.
Okay.
Before the election, you mean?
Before the elections.
No. I don't think there's a high probability because I think the military is not prepared for major changes to the Constitution. The military, what happens in this country right now is up to the military. And it's just going to be that way, at least for another term. And I think they're not ready yet to let go of the privileges they have in the Constitution. In fact, they're probably nervous that it's come up so fast. They didn't want it to come up in the first term. They wanted it to wait till the second.
I wonder if it's a question about privileges. I think that they are really concerned about what they regard as the security of the state.
Well,
their regard of the security of the state and our regard of what the security of the state is made are two different things, as Mary Callahan has pointed out very clearly in her an article she wrote. So they view this, there's a fear on the part of the military that the minorities, the civilians will screw up, and that they, as guardians of the state, have to be there. Now, that may not be accurate, but that is, I think, a widely held perception.
But they also fear Shui Man, and he's military.
Well, that's another point of where General Fan Shui gets in the act.
There's one piece of clarification that I'm still trying to pursue. If you remember, I raised it with Shui Man as well. And at that time, this issue was still in abeyance. And that is the elections for the upper house. And this is a very crucial point. will the elections for the upper house be based on a first-past-the-post system, or will it be based on a proportional representation system? Now, there's a bill that's been approved by Parliament which says it will be done on a proportional representation system.
By
but
the
it's
upper
currently,
house.
yes, but it's currently pending the Constitutional Tribunal. What is the likelihood that it will be proportional representation? Because it has a big impact. Because if it's PR, then it means you will have significant numbers of the USDP that will be elected to Parliament, even though they may not
But are you
necessarily
talking about
be
the upper house or the lower
The upper
house?
house. Talking about the upper house.
Well, it doesn't matter that much in the upper house because the constituencies are so big. It's the lower house where it really matters, and that's been ruled out. In
Right.
fact,
Well, what is
they've-
going to
they've
happen is
ruled that it's unconstitutional for the
You're
lower
going to
house.
see a proliferation of minority parties. You already have that.
Yes.
And they are going to be very important in sort of getting, sizing up the power structure after the elections. There are going to be many more of the minority parties involved.
Okay, so let me then ask a follow-on question to you. So let's assume that the parliamentary elections go ahead, and they go ahead freely and fairly. It's fairly peaceful. What do you think will be the outcome? Are we going to get a situation where the USDP wins a reasonable number of seats, or do you expect that the NLD will make more or less a clean sweep as it did in the 2012 by-elections, or do you think it's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag? David?
I think it would probably be a mixed bag. There are plenty of people in the USDP who are known in their local areas, who have reputations, not all of them bad, based upon their professional qualifications, also military, but not all military. And so I assume that they will get a reasonable number of seats, but I would assume that the NLD will win the majority.
Just the majority, but not over 50% of the seats? Because if it wins over 50% of the seats, then it's in a very strong position, right?
Well,
Vis-a-vis
maybe over 50%. I'm not
quite that
trying to, trying to be actually very specific about this because I wouldn't have any idea at the local level. But I do think that there are eminent people who will be in the USDP, and the USDP will get some sort of reasonable proportion, but the NLD will do very well.
Priscilla?
One of the NGOs in Yangon, it's called Pyopin, it's Burmese, but it's supported by the British Council, has done a study of the political parties recently that's quite interesting. And they were trying to predict a little bit, based on the past, what the voter patterns would be. And when they looked at past elections, 1990, 2012, and so forth, where the NLD was present, the vote went so predominantly to the NLD that they reach a conclusion that, in a way, voting for the NLD is voting against the military.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And they think that that's still a very strong sentiment in the voting public. And so if you go by past patterns, it looks very much like the NLD will take a big win. But you have to temper that because of the new system. And also because of the status that the minority parties have now. You have to assume that in the 7 states, the minority states, the ethnic states, that the ethnic parties will take a lot more seats than they currently have. Right now, most of the ethnic members in the upper house and even in the lower house are members of the USDP, not necessarily ethnic parties. And this time around, they're probably going to run as ethnic leaders, as ethnic politicians, not as USDP. But the USDP is in these areas making coalitions, developing coalitions with these little parties and supporting their election races so that they'll be on their side in the end. The USDP expects to lose a lot of seats in this election. Some senior people in the government don't even think they're going to get 25%. They need 26% along with the military to control things. They don't even think they're going to get that. So what they're doing to compensate is building coalitions, not only with ethnic minority parties, but also with some of these other democracy parties, like the NDF, the National Democracy Front, who came out of the NLD but have been completely disowned by the NLD. So they sort of have gone over to the dark side, if you want to put it that way. at any rate, this is what I mean about coalitions. There is going to be a lot of trading in this next parliament. It's not going to be the same creature that it is today, one way or the other. And the NLD is going to be, I would predict, this is the one prediction I will make, will be if the elections are free and fair, if people can vote the way they want to and their votes get counted, the NLD will be the largest party in the parliament among the elected members. Whether it will have an absolute majority or not is another question, and that may not be. But the NLD can also make coalitions, because many of the little ethnic parties came out of the NLD. Shan NLD, for example, which isn't so little, and they will be coalitions with the NLD. So it's going to be a very
complex and fast-moving situation, right?
And it's not going to be as controlled by the military as it is now. So this remains the big question over the elections. Will the military allow these elections to be free and fair so that you are then in a new situation politically?
Scott, I'm not trying to ignore you. I recognize you've been very, but I didn't want to put you on the spot and ask you to make these sorts of predictions. But I will push you a little bit on a statement you made in your introductory remarks, where you talked about the U.S. position vis-a-vis free and fair elections. Now, all elections around the world, especially in developing countries, have some degrees of problems and so forth, right? And you said that the United States would be satisfied if the people believe that the outcome of the vote reflects their wishes. But how do you know that?
Yeah.
How are you going to make that determination? These are always shades of gray, difficult judgments.
No, it's a good point. And by the way, I had a lot of great predictions, but I forgot the prediction sheet back in the office, so sorry. Next time.
Your mind is a sieve.
Yeah. This is actually really hard stuff. I mean, you've just heard from the experts how complex the political scene is. I was in Sean's state a few months ago meeting with political parties, and just in one state, a big state, but still just in one state, the politics are immensely complex, and then you multiply that, throughout the country. So I think what we're saying, we're always pushing for the best possible elections, not only in Myanmar, but anywhere. The most inclusive, the freest campaigning, the free press, in this case, constitutional amendments to make Constitution more democratic. So we will continue to push that. But in the end, when the elections happen, it will be somewhat subjective. There's not going to be a perfect scientific test. If they're really bad, I think we'll know that. There'll be a lot of observers. I think the media will be out. I think we'll have a pretty good sense if there's major fraud or these sorts of things. But if the NLD and the other political parties campaign, run through the elections, political parties generally don't say, yeah, we lost. That's a hard one. But I think, if the combination of what the observers say, what the press says, the reaction of the parties themselves, and the people who we're able to talk to and others are able to talk to, we'll have to make a admittedly somewhat subjective assessment of, were these elections, how good were these elections, and it's not going to be almost certainly not going to be the perfect election. I think that's a given. So, but in the end, if the key players and the general sense of the society was these elections were credible, free and fair within the constraints that we know exist, transparent, vote, people were able to vote, votes are counted fairly, etc. Then I think we would say this is a good thing.
Are you worried, Scott, that there may be an outcome where the international community may be split in its judgment? You may have, as David suggested, Japan might think that the elections were adequate enough for them to continue with relations and so forth, whereas other groups may not. To what extent, in such situations, does the United States, in fact, confer with other members of the international community before arriving at a judgment?
Well, I think certainly we'll be talking to others. But I think in the end, it's going to matter mostly, we're going to be guided mostly by what the people of the country say and how they respond. And yeah, I said it will be presumably somewhere on a scale between, hopefully not in the really bad side, almost certainly not in the perfect side. It'll be somewhere in between, and I think we'll be guided. How does the NLD react? How do other political parties react? How do the people react? Are there big demonstrations? All these sorts of things we'll sort of have to look at and make a
And presumably
judgment.
there'll be several representatives from the United States who will be acting as official observers of the election. So I think their judgment will also play a big role, right? In your final
right.
position.
And
Carter
again,
Center's already got invited.
what really matters is, what the people in the country say. If people say, okay, we ran in the elections, maybe they weren't perfect, but we're planning to take our seats in Parliament, we're moving ahead, then that will be very significant for us. We aren't going to be, if the participants in the election determined that they were willing to move on with the results, I think then, that's going to be really significant.
I note you choose your words carefully, because when you say participants in the election, is that code for Aung San Suu Kyi? Will her judgment mean a big deal, a great deal?
Among others, certainly her judgment will matter. It's not just her judgment, but certainly her judgment will matter.
I think you also have to look at what the military could do to manipulate the elections. And this is aside from everything else that's being done. And one point is the military vote. The military will themselves, members of the military, will be voting in the election. They will be voting largely on military bases. And the monitors and the observers don't get onto the military bases unless there's some extraordinary decision taken between now and then. This issue has already been raised. In fact, it was raised with Shuaiman when he was here.
It's a great point, because in the 2010 elections, that's exactly what happened. There was apparently a lot of...
Well, there were a lot of early votes, but
Voting,
they've
yes.
addressed the question of early voting, and they have come up with a system that should prevent the misuse of early voting that occurred in 2010. Should, I say. But they haven't addressed the military piece. Now, the military numbers may be 200,000 people, not all of them eligible to vote, but, well, probably all are eligible to vote one way or the other. But probably not all of them will vote, and that's not going to be the overwhelming vote, but it could make a big difference in certain constituencies. So that's one thing. The other thing is this. The Union Election Commission relies upon the local administration around the country for its staffing, for how it's going to be running the polls at the local area, local regions, local constituencies. And the local administration all over the country is something called the General Administration Department of the Ministry of Home Affairs. They're military, ex-military. It's all controlled by the military system. And I mean the uniform military system. So there's a question about the integrity of GAD. And that's one of the weak points. Now, everybody who's working on the elections, and I'm talking about NDI and IRI and IFES and the Carter Center, all of these people are out there working hard on all these details. They know about this. They've been talking openly about it. The UEC is aware of it. They're trying to address the question. But this country has a very weak administrative system and very weak local governance and no experience with these complex elections. So there's a lot of room for things to go wrong in different areas, and those are the two big areas that I think we need to look at. If the military tries to somehow impede the elections, I think that it'll be in those two areas. So
Okay,
that's something to watch.
I want to move on because we've got lots of other issues to cover. But let's now assume that the parliamentary elections have taken place, David. And we are going through this process of the three groups that Priscilla noted, to elect the president, the three parliamentary groups. Who are the principal candidates for the presidency currently? I presume others may crop up in due course, but currently, who do you think will be the key candidates standing?
Well, there have been four mentioned, essentially. Shuaiman, obviously, Min Aung Hlaing, head of the military, Thein Sein, we'll come back to that in a second,
Right.
and Kin Aung Min. Those have been mentioned in the media a lot. The question of Thein Sein is, a year ago, high-level people in Naypyidaw said to me, Thein Sein will resign along with his critical ministers. Whether that was true then, I don't know. Whether it's still true, I don't know. And whether it will be true, I don't know. But certainly there will be pressures from his associates to keep him in office, because that's always the way bureaucracies work, right? The jobs depend upon the top guy. So I don't know what will happen, but those four names keep coming up. And there may be others, but those are certainly the ones in the media.
And which of them do you think has got the greatest chances to succeed, ultimately?
That's where the question of the role of Than Shwe comes in. Now, when Ne Win was out of office after 88, for at least 4 years he had influence in society, even though he was retired from all positions. He was the person who finally determined they could get rid of General Saw Maung as head of state. That was an inquiry given directly to him to approve that process. If that is a kind of pattern, then I would assume that Than Shwe has some very important role into this. Who he likes among these people, the question of Shwe Man or Min Aung Hlaing, this is a critical issue. And I don't know the role of Than Shwe. You hear all kinds of rumors. Maybe Priscilla knows more.
He's
Scot
already
Marciel,
stated his likes and dislikes. We know his likes and dislikes because he's already said what they are. There are two viable candidates right now for president, Thein Sein and Shwe Man. Min Aung Hlaing, the latest rumor is that he's going to take off his uniform and run for a parliamentary seat so that he's there in the wings. Thein Sein, President Thein Sein, does not have to step down, does not have to declare his intentions at all.
Yeah, that's true.
At all. Because he can be picked at the last minute by the military group as their nominee.
And
so
between the two,
he can just stay in place between now and the end of, until the time they start nominating candidates for president. He does not have to run for the parliament again. And this is a dilemma. This was a dilemma very much on the mind, I think, of another presidential candidate who has already stated that in public that he wants to change the provision in the Constitution that allows a president to be chosen who is not a member of the parliament. He wants to make it obligatory that presidential candidates or vice presidential candidates have to be elected first to the parliament, so they have some endorsement from the people. But, this is in fact 60C in the Constitution. We focus on 59F, which prevents Aung San Suu Kyi, but 59C says that the candidates must be an elected person. But then in the next section of the parliament, 60C, it says the presidential candidates can be chosen from among eminent people. They don't have to be elected. So President Thein Sein has the option of holding back until the last minute and seeing what happens in the early elections before he decides whether he wants to try for a second term. But my guess is that he is Than Shwe's preference, and he and Min Aung Hlaing, not Shwe Man.
Okay, I want to move on to another big issue which also is going to affect the election, and that is this whole peace process that's taking place. When were you in Myanmar? Very recently?
About 10 days ago.
About 10 days ago.
With Deputy Secretary Blinken.
Right. So at the end of March, there was a peace agreement that had been agreed and had to be signed. But so far, the ethnic armed groups have not signed it. And even, in fact, today and tomorrow and day after, they're going through a meeting to decide whether they want to go ahead and sign it or whether they actually want further changes to it. So when you were in Myanmar, what did you pick up about the factors behind this seeming change of heart or change of position of the group that actually negotiated the earlier agreement, which is now in question?
Yeah, I would guess that David and Priscilla will be more expert on this than I am, but I'm not sure it's a change of heart. I mean, I think even back in March, April, there were still outstanding issues at play. And we did meetings both not only with government but with non-government and representatives of the ethnic groups. Certainly one of the big issues is the extent to which, the extent of inclusivity, whether all the groups, the armed groups, should be able to sign onto it. And my understanding is the government position is no, and that at least a number of the ethnic armed groups say that all the armed groups, there's a few that don't have ceasefires that weren't part of the initial signing, so that's one big question. But I think there's still a number of other outstanding issues to be resolved. That was the one that people highlighted to us. So I'm not sure how much of it's a change of heart and how much it just wasn't really fully baked as of March or April.
David?
No, I think that the government is under pressure. They want to have something happen. I mean, this is a question partly of the legitimacy of the government. And it's important for them, even if they're saying we're not to run again. This is, I say, the critical issue facing the state over these, since 1948. And getting some modus vivendi that people can agree to that is fair in some Burmese fashion is the problem. And I don't know what the answer to that is going to be. But clearly, even if you have a ceasefire, that is not the peace process. Peace process follows thereafter when you start negotiating the details and the distribution of actual power, the distribution of resources. That is a long process and it's going to take, I think, some years to develop. But the first issue is getting the ceasefire in place.
Okay, one last question I'm going to ask Scott, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So, Scott, the question to you is this. I mean, in the last few weeks, there's been this whole issue of the Rohingya boat people and the terrible conditions they face in Myanmar. And to what extent is that influencing or affecting the thinking of the United States in the way it looks at Myanmar and at these elections? And is the administration and are the Congress and the administration on the same page on this issue, or are there differences of opinion? And while you're answering that question, is it also likely or could affect the question of U.S. sanctions towards Burma? Is this something that's being thought about in the administration?
Yeah. So on the Rohingya, the situation of the migrants. First of all, this is something we've been very focused on, something that Deputy Secretary Blinken talked a lot about, not only in Burma, but in Indonesia as well, and that other parts of the administration have been very engaged on. So there's the immediate issue of the people who ventured out on boats, and our best understanding is, a certain percentage of those are people who came from Bangladesh, ethnic Bangladeshis, a certain percentage of Rohingya. We don't have, and I don't think the UN yet has an exact breakdown. So the first priority, of course, has been trying to save people who are in a very perilous situation. And that's involved working with a number of governments in the region to try to convince people to take in boatloads of people who are in a very difficult situation. And fortunately, a number of governments have stepped up. So that's item one. There's been lots of talk in this context of addressing the root causes, including the situation in Rakhine State. But I would step back. For us, this has been, one of the priority issues. There's a number of issues that President Obama, Secretary Kerry, others, officials who've been visiting Burma, Myanmar over the last few years have raised consistently. Elections, the peace process, general human rights situation, et cetera. And the situation in Rakhine State, the situation facing the Rohingya has been one of those issues. It highlighted again by the recent events, but it was very much on our agenda before. And it's, as you all know, an incredibly complex issue that involves not only government policies, but also deep-seated prejudices within the country. And if you go there, you can hear, you don't have to talk to very many people to see this. So what we've advocated and continue to advocate for, again, for the people who've left by boat, humanitarian treatment, safe place to stay, at least temporarily, until their long-term situation is resolved. But then for the people in Rakhine State, access to humanitarian assistance, food, education, medical care, these sorts of things, just basic humanitarian situation. The importance of freedom of mobility, to be able to move around, then access to livelihoods, and a path to citizenship, so that people who are at this point considered stateless there's some mechanism in place for them to at least have the chance to attain citizenship, and with that, the rights that come with citizenship. In addition, of course, there's the much, in some ways, even harder process and challenge for the country of trying to deal with the prejudices and the fears that are behind this. So it's a hugely important issue, a hugely difficult issue. In terms of the administration and Congress on this issue and more broadly on our policy, I mean, I would say there's, in general, widely held agreement between the administration and most people on Capitol Hill, with a general thrust, of course, of supporting this opening, this democratic transition as much as possible, and as part of that, trying to do as much as we can to secure a better situation for all of the people of the country. Of course, there are differing views, certainly within Congress, as you would expect, on tactics and pressure points, and how bad are things on a particular issue or not. We have a regular dialogue, a constant dialogue with a lot of members and staff who care. I would say I spend more time up on the Hill on Burma than on any other issue by far. We don't always agree, but I think there's a pretty good dialogue, and we certainly listen very carefully to what friends on the Hill have to say. In terms of sanctions, we have the still in existence the SDN list, where people can be added to or taken off. We have begun to use that in terms of adding and taking people off on a small scale. So that still exists, but at this point, that's kind of where we are.
Thanks. I completely agree with you that it is striking when you go to Myanmar how widespread this prejudice is against the Rohingya, and it cuts across all political stripes, it cuts across economic strata. It's quite striking. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's open it up to the audience. I want to let you know that this session is actually being streamed live, so wait till you get the mic. Please give us your name and your institutional affiliation. And if you could keep your questions brief, that would be terrific, because then that way we can get more questions into the session. So let's have this lady right up front here.
Thank you very much, Erin Murphy, Inlay Advisory Group. One question on the NLD, whether this is a point to gain leverage or if it's just talk, but there is hints of a boycott. How likely do you think that is? And what would be the factors to influence that decision? And also a follow-up question to that is, do you foresee a potential split in the NLD akin to the NDF split, but more the majority of the party looking to contest and some deciding that maybe this isn't for them? Thanks.
David?
If I may say something that's completely in left field, I think that if the NLD decided, that Aung San Suu Kyi actually decided that she wanted to boycott, the United States would put very great pressure on her not to boycott. But that I leave to my colleague.
But what about this point
Professor
about...
said that, not me.
What about the... Yeah, Priscilla.
I don't think the NLD is planning to boycott the elections. I think that Aung San Suu Kyi said that because she was trying to pressure the president to hold the six-party talks. That's when she originally said it. I think it was said for public effect. However, if there were clear signs before the elections that somehow the conservative side of the government and the military were moving in on the elections to change the rules of the elections, to make it difficult for the NLD, they might decide that they weren't going to participate in such a blatantly manipulated process. That's why they kept out of it in 1990. If the same circumstances began to arise again, then I could see them saying, wait a minute, this isn't fair. Because they don't want to run and not be properly represented with the voters. But as long as the elections appear to be running free and fair, it would be absurd for them to boycott, because the only way to change the Constitution is to be in the Parliament. You have to be in the Parliament to change the Constitution. You cannot do it from outside. So just boycotting on a whim doesn't make sense.
Right.
Great. Somebody from this side, you had a hand up right at the back there. Yes, please.
Stephanie Scruggs from Dupawe Development. I wonder if you could comment on how the election might change property rights. We've heard from many of the ethnic minorities, particularly the Karen, that they might be able to attract more to the peace process if they were in charge of the property on which they sit and actually had the rights to utilize that property for and resources for the local interest.
So this is all closely tied up with the ethnic, sort of the discussions with the ethnic groups and the political dialogue that is to follow the ceasefire.
One of the critical issues facing the state as a whole, but especially important in minority areas, is the land grabbing issue. The land issue is one of the critical socio-economic problems facing the state. And that has to be addressed. It's in the legislature now. There's been discussions about what to do. The military is supposed to have given back some land, but very little compared to what they've taken. And that is really something that one has to concentrate on. Originally, of course, under the Constitution of 1947, the government owns all the land. That was done to make sure that the Indians and the Chinese did not control the economy. And they wanted to get the economy back under Burmese control. Okay, that is understandable. But at this stage, all of this time, because the government owns the land, it was not available for use as a credit mechanism. So you could not borrow on the value of your land since you didn't own the land. Now that has changed. There is legislation to have that stop. But still the issue remains, and I don't see an answer right now, but certainly it will be addressed, and I think we should be trying to deal in some manner through expert advice in a quiet way to see what we can do to help this process, because it is really critical.
Do you want to add anything, Priscilla?
Well, if the question is whether the elections will affect this, the answer is no.
But may I add one point, which I think is relevant to your question, and that is that property rights as far as resources are concerned, natural resources, which I think in part your question pointed to, will depend upon the agreement, if any, between the government and the ethnic states on fiscal arrangements which are associated with the federal structure. So the sort of the sharing of revenues that arise from natural resource exploitation between the states and the center is a crucial dimension of a federal structure. And we are far away from that point at this stage, so I don't think anybody can prognosticate on that issue. So being a bipartisan think tank, I'm going to go once again from the left to the right, and yes, up here.
Thank you. I'm Steve Hirsch. I'm a journalist. Two questions to Scot Marciel. You said at the outset that the United States was pushing for amendments to the Constitution. I'm wondering what you're pushing for and how it's going. I mean, especially given Priscilla's comment that, as many people say, nothing major is likely to change. The other thing is that Aung San Suu Kyi said in that same Reuters interview that somebody referred to a moment ago, raised the possibility that the elections might be canceled or not held. What do you think the odds of that happening are, and what would the impact be on U.S. policy? Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we're not being extremely prescriptive. We're very aware that this is a sovereign nation, and they need to decide the details of their constitution. What we're saying is, if you want to make this transition to democracy, and certainly we want to support you, that it's important to make sure that your constitution is a constitution that's appropriate for a democracy. And there are any number of elements of the Constitution that many people in the country, as well as outside, have noted don't really fit in a democratic system. The president, when he was there, when that was asked about the specific prohibition on Aung San Suu Kyi and others running for president. And again, he was, I don't remember his exact words, but he was careful not to be too specific, but just said it's sort of a really unusual situation in a democracy to have a provision that wouldn't let a very popular politician run.
You want to go beyond him?
No, I think I'll stick with what the president said. So, again, we're not going and saying, here's our proposed amendment. We're not doing that at all. What we're saying is there's a push for a more democratic system, and we, would encourage you to move down that path. People lay different odds on the possibility of whether amendments happen before the election. We would love to see amendments that make the Constitution more democratic sooner. But if they don't happen before the election, there's certainly opportunities, as Priscilla and David said, after the election. As for the prospect of the elections not being held, I mean, I can't really make a prediction. What I can say is that I've been twice in the last few months, talked to a lot of different people. At this point, it seems that all the players, the government, the UEC, the political parties are all acting as if they expect the elections to happen. And my sense is that there's some hopefulness that they will happen and that they will be a serious effort to have quality elections. That can change, but I mean, all I can say is at this point, it seems that there is a serious effort underway to have these elections.
Shall I add to that? If the elections are to be held the first week in November or the early November, as the UEC has said, they're going to have to make an announcement soon because there has to be a campaign period. And senior officials have suggested to me that the announcement will come at the end of July, early August. So we're getting very close to the cutoff point. And once they get to that point, the campaigning starts in earnest. It would be difficult to turn that train around.
All right, let's have yes, Professor Jackson.
Hi, Carl Jackson from SAIS. I'm interested in the views of the panel on the so-called interim period, which I think will be more important than the election itself. That is, there will have to be a deal at the top of the elite, which includes all of the major competitors. And what happens if Aung San Suu Kyi is dissatisfied with that deal and then cries foul?
David? You're the go-to person on tough questions.
No, that could well happen. But the question is, what kind of credibility would she have under those circumstances? And it would be less than she had before, I think. I think her stature has diminished somewhat by, certainly in the international circles because of the Rohingya lack of support, but internally because actually the government support has gone up. In other words, while a lot of people don't like the military, they certainly like the military better now than they liked it 4 years ago. So I think it will be important. It certainly would affect international opinion because there is a very strong body of international support for her under any circumstances. And as one former congressional staffer said when she was under house arrest, I know more about what Aung San Suu Kyi thinks than Aung San Suu Kyi. That's a quote.
Vikram, can I
Yes,
add
please.
to that? Carl, I won't try to predict what happens in December, January, but I would say, I think Priscilla mentioned or David mentioned the so-called six-party talks that have at least happened once and are some expectation will continue. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why these talks are so important because this is all new territory, right? And so I think there's a lot of questions about how this works, even in the country, and how this will work. And that's why we're big supporters of this kind of dialogue so that the key players ahead of time and up from now up through the election and even after the election can talk about constitutional amendments and all these sorts of things. I don't know whether there's a specific deal or whatever that needs to be struck, but I think dialogue and trying to talk through how do we deal with these sorts of issues could be very helpful.
I think there's a corollary to that, to the point that you raised. What if there's a deal that the military finds unacceptable? There's the other side of the coin as well. All right, any further questions? Yes, please, right at the back. Gentleman at the back.
Hi, my name is Nyan. I'm just a student from Burma studying in the US. So my question is that from my understanding, there are about 700,000 Rohingya in Burma, and there are about 500,000 in Bangladesh. So let's assume for a moment that there has been some changes in the government, and we, as Burmese government, decided to give those 700,000 people from the side of Burma, like for human rights and freedom to mobility and the path to citizenship, everything that we hope that they should have. If that happened, and their state have 500,000 in Bangladesh side, right? So my question is that if that happened, would the U.S. government would state pressure the Burmese government to accept that out of 500,000 from the Bangladesh side, or would they pressure Bangladesh government?
I think that's addressed to you, Scott.
There's a precedent for this, in case Scott doesn't know.
Well, yeah, and Priscilla's going to save me here with her strong background on refugee and migration affairs. I mean, it's kind of hard to address something like this that's so hypothetical. At this point, in terms of our relationship and our dialogue with the government in Naypyidaw, we're focused on the livelihood and the treatment of the people inside the country. We're not pushing for people to move one way or the other across the border at all, but rather the people inside the country. And we don't have perfect information at all on this population to know. I think it's widely believed that many of them have been there for quite some time. Possibly generations. Others may have arrived more recently, but we just don't have great information on that. So what the focus right now is that the conditions right now inside Rakhine State for this community. I mean, obviously, Rakhine State as a whole is extremely poor. I believe it's the second poorest state in the country. So there's a lot of need for development work throughout the state. But focus on the conditions facing right now this particular community, particularly the restrictions, the additional restrictions, and lack of freedoms and lack of citizenship. So that's really our focus.
Great. Yes, please, up here.
Hi, Jenna Morgenstern-Gaines from the Albright Stonebridge Group. I have a question regarding the Rohingya crisis and the reaction of the international community. We've seen that Pakistan and Gambia have stood up for the Rohingya in solidarity, both all being of Muslim background. I'm wondering if you have any insight into whether there'll be a greater statement or reaction from the OIC or any other organizations that are organizing different Muslim groups across the world. Thank you.
I don't know anything about that.
Scott?
Yeah, I don't think I have a great answer. The OIC has been involved to some extent in this process and has spoken and has visited the country. So it's an issue certainly for some members, but I can't say, to be honest, going forward, whether they'll decide to become more active on it.
And what I can say is that within ASEAN, individual countries have made sort of informal representations, in some cases even formal representations to Myanmar to see if they can sort of resolve this issue. I'm thinking especially now of Indonesia and of course Malaysia. They've been affected, as has Thailand, but I think Malaysia and Indonesia have better credentials as sort of Islamic countries to press this case with Myanmar. But as you also know, this is not an issue which ASEAN can discuss as a group because there is this principle of non-intervention, and in each country's affairs. So non-interference in each country's affairs, which prevents that discussion from happening, which is unfortunate. Yes, there was a hand. Yes, Professor Weiss.
Bill Wise, Johns Hopkins SAIS. On the subject of intervention, other than on the Rohingya issue, what evidence have you seen of Indian and Chinese interest in the forthcoming election? What sort of interventions have they made, either overtly or otherwise? And lastly, what might you expect as the campaign actually begins to take shape?
Do you want to say anything about the Indian-Chinese?
Yeah, the truth is I haven't seen much. That doesn't mean that they're not doing things or active in some way, but it's not something that's come across my desk.
Priscilla?
I'm sure the Chinese are watching it with great interest, but they haven't asked to send observers yet.
And what about...
Chinese are, of course, well experienced with democratic elections. And India, I'm sure, is also watching with great interest. They are a democracy and will probably, they may even have people among observer groups, particularly a UN Nambiar, after all. What happens when the elections start running? I think we're going to see a lot of candidates scurrying around in their constituencies, competing with each other. I think there are more than 80 parties lining up to run in the elections. Most of them are small local parties. Some of them are not going to win anything. But there's just going to be a tremendous amount of activity. I think there'll be a big question about whether, and this question has already been raised, about whether candidates can campaign outside of their own constituency.
My question is not about what will happen inside the country, but rather...
Use the mic, Bill.
Try to influence during the campaign.
Could you please use the mic and say that again? 1 second. Just please say that again.
My question was not what happens within the country amongst Burmese themselves, but rather what might you expect India and China to do to influence the outcome, if anything, once the campaign actually begins?
I don't think they'll do anything,
David?
except continue fighting on the border.
No, I agree. I don't think they'll do anything, but there is one subtext there on the Indian side. There's a small Naga group that refused to sign the ceasefires because they want to look at a greater Nagaland. Now remember that out of these sub-14 legislatures, the regional and state legislatures, under those there are 6 sub-legislatures for townships in the case of Wa Division. One of those is the Naga group, which relates to the Naga in Nagaland in India. And so this group said in one of their press reports that we are looking for a greater Nagaland, which must scare the hell out of everybody.
Well, there's a further subtext to this because the Naga leader in India, who was a leader in reaching an agreement with the Indian authorities for peace in India, was in fact deputed to be an advisor to the peace talks, as to give the Indian example as to how they reached an agreement. So there are wheels within wheels and circles within circles on this one. Yes, there was a hand up here. Yes, please, lady right here. It's coming.
Hi,
Let's make this the last 2 questions. Yes, please.
I'm Jennifer Chang. I'm a research assistant at the Embassy of India. I was wondering if this transition to democracy might actually exacerbate the status of the Rohingya migrants in the sense that political parties might use this anti-Rohingya sentiment to maybe kind of forge ties with others, and whether these Buddhist monks might actually feel that they have lesser restrictions on their speech, on their kind of anti-hate speech against the Rohingya.
That's a great question. And may I add to that question? Also, will the next government be as interested and aggressive in pursuing the peace talks? So there's a combination of the attitude towards the Rohingyas as well as the attitude towards the peace talks themselves.
It's hard to say if you don't know what the next government's going to be. I think that the issue of the Rohingya, or it's really the Muslim-Buddhist divide, in the country. If that becomes an issue in the elections, it will be the monks and the Rakhine that raise it. It'll be certainly an issue in Rakhine State, but those elections are controlled completely by Rakhine parties. So we can assume that it's an issue that the Rakhine will control in their own state. But to the extent that it becomes an issue in other constituencies, I think the government is very concerned about election security, and they're watching for any signs of activity that could promote violence during the elections, and this is one of them. So I think they'll be very alert to community activity that points in the direction of further Muslim Burmese violence. I don't see any coming in the Rakhine State because it's not an election issue there. It's an election issue in other parts of the country.
If there's one thing that could stop the whole reform process, affect the elections, affect the future government, it is an outbreak of violence in Burma proper against the Muslim community. That would get out of hand. The government would have to declare martial law. The military would take over. Everything would stop for a period. We don't know how long. And that is a real danger. So I'm sure the government is very aware of this problem and would do everything it could to avoid it. But it is something that we have to keep in the back of the mind because this is such a volatile issue in the society.
All right, last question on this side. I saw a hand raised earlier. Okay, there are no hands. Okay, fantastic. Oh, yes, Hunter.
I had a question. Hi, I'm Hunter Marston, independent Southeast Asia analyst. The current system with one house electing representatives by first past the post and another by proportional representation is a complex one.
It's not decided yet.
It's not decided, right? So my question that follows is, when might the Constitutional Tribunal rule on this, and what implications does it have for the forthcoming elections?
They have ruled on the lower house and said that it's unconstitutional.
But it's the upper house that's still up for grabs.
Still being decided in the upper house. I don't know what the Constitutional Tribunal would
When
say.
Shweman was here, his answer to that question was it will be done by the end of May, but that hasn't happened, obviously, and we're going to have to wait and see.
Or if it has, we don't know about it.
Right. All right, so I think that's brought us to the end of this event. I want to thank all of you very much for being such an engaged audience, for asking terrific questions, but please join me in thanking the three panelists for a terrific set of comments.
Precedent is that we don't. We have
This is a very technical, solid, substantive